Okay, well, I want to talk a little bit about the about Machiavelli's teaching on the military, and this teaching primarily appears in chapters 12 through 14. And at first, it seems rather straightforward, as is sometimes the case with Machiavelli. He writes in chapter 12, "The principal foundations on which the power of all governments is based are good laws and good armies. And since where there cannot be good laws, where there are not good armies, and since where there are good armies there must be good laws, I will omit any discussion of laws and will talk about armies." Well, that sounds like the only thing that's important to Machiavelli is the military, that he really doesn't care about armies, or he thinks that those who are strong because they have armies make the laws, and therefore there's no discussion of the laws is necessary. But when we look at what Machiavelli has to say about the military and what choice the prince should make, what type of soldiers he should have, the lesson that comes from this passage becomes a little less clear, or maybe more clear. It's different than it first appears to be. Now, at Machiavelli's time, there were four choices, three of which were very popular, and the fourth, which was not, and excuse me, the numbers are out of sequence there, but the first is the mercenary army. Second is the nobility, members of the noble class. Third, auxiliaries, which are troops from other countries. And fourth, the citizens themselves, the common people of your country, known as the militia. So let's talk about each of these in turn and see what Machiavelli might think of them, what he does think of them. First of all, mercenaries. Mercenaries are a paid professional army. Lots of times in Italy they revolved around a particular family that had been in the business of providing this type of fighting service for a long time. Machiavelli mentions in these chapters the Orsini and the Vitelli, for instance, Italian families that the Cesare Borgia hired in his ruling of the Romagna. Now, when we think about this type of army, we do think in terms of strengths and weaknesses. You have to balance the strengths against the weaknesses, and their strengths are many, actually, more than I have there. They are professionally trained. They're professionals. They train continuously when they are not actually fighting. They have the experience of many battles behind them. They display a certain type of courage because of that experience. They're not quick to bolt because they know the difference between danger and just difficulty. They are equipped. They equip themselves. They've paid for their arms, and so even though you're paying them and thus paying for their equipment, you're sharing that cost of their equipment with all the other people who have paid them in the past. You don't have to buy all of those things yourself, and so this saves money. Also, they are not always necessary, and so when you don't need them, you don't have to pay for them. So unlike a standing army that you constantly have to be maintaining and upkeeping, the militia or the mercenary is there just when you need them, and you pay them a good price, but probably not as much as you would if you were trying to raise your own. However, Machiavelli squares in on the weaknesses of the militia. He doesn't like the militia idea the mercenaries. If he was going to point out any strength, it would be that they're professional. But when it comes to these various types of military, since he's ultimately going to argue for the citizen militia, he focuses in on the weaknesses. And of course, the primary weakness of the mercenary force is that they are unwilling to risk their lives when it comes right down to it. Now, they will take a certain amount of risk because of their experience. They know when that risk is reasonable. But when it comes down to they're likely to die if they stay and fight, of course they're going to leave. They're going to retreat because the point is they're there for the money. It's a job for them. And no job is worth dying for, okay? Also, there's a slight risk that they will switch sides for more pay. Machiavelli does worry about this, but maybe not as much, because the coin in this area is reputation, and if a mercenary force was constantly switching sides for the highest bidder, pretty soon they would be unemployed. So, but nevertheless, there's always that possibility of allure, and it would be raised even more so if the mercenaries thought that your side was truly going down. Then it would make very much sense for them to switch to the other side, receive their pay, and come out on top in that battle. Now, then there's the force that is made up of the nobility. These are the nobles and their vassals, their knights. They owned a lot of land, and they had a lot of force at their disposal. And they had many strengths. They were well trained in a different way. They were constantly at tournaments. They were constantly practicing with each other. They were constantly going out hunting. And they had nothing else to do, really, the men of the noble class, other than to continually train for battle. So they did so. Also, they're wealthy, so they equip themselves and their vassals, their knights. They don't have to be given money to do these things. And also another strength, which is not listed there, is that they have a stake in the battle, more so than mercenaries by far, because it's their lands potentially that are under assault, their own interest, which needs to be defended. However, they too have a lot of weaknesses, and of course Machiavelli zeroes in on them. Okay, the nobles, as he said before, are a group of people who cannot be satisfied. They have very high expectations. They live a high life. And so when they go into this type of situation, they want to come out better off than they were before, personally. They aren't going to just take these lands and other people's lives for the sake of the prince and for the strength of the nation as a whole. They're going to want to take things for themselves. They're going to want to take prisoners and ransom them. They're going to want to take booty from castles. They're going to want to take land and keep it and so forth. And the more of this that they get, Machiavelli points out, the more power they get, the more untrustworthy they are. Okay, they will just want more and more and more. And finally, they may even see the prince as not in their own self-interest. They may ally with each other or ally with a foreign power, whatever they think will actually enhance their own individual stake is more important. So what first appears to be a strength, the fact that they have land and power and so forth in your territory, can turn out from the prince's perspective to be a weakness. Now, the auxiliaries. Well, you may recall Cesare Borgia used auxiliaries. His father, Alexander, actually made an alliance with the French and borrowed those troops from the French, and with those troops, Borgia was able to take the Romagna. So you would think that the auxiliaries would look like a good option, but then think again, Machiavelli has more problems with them. Yes, they are well trained and well equipped. However, they are from another country. They're loyal not to you, but definitely to their own prince, if not just to themselves. And once they're there and they've been successful, they may actually decide just to simply stay and take whatever it is they've gained for themselves. Now, this didn't happen in the case of Borgia, and it might not happen frequently, because again, the alliance means something. Again, the coin in international relations is reputation. And in a lot of cases, there's enough incentive for a country to abide by its original agreement for the sake of that, but it's no guarantee that you haven't been fooled by another power which has a force capable of just simply staying and taking what the other prince wants. So all of these boil down to trustworthiness. Machiavelli, for many reasons, finds that mercenaries and nobles and auxiliaries, all three, are ultimately untrustworthy. You can't count on them. If things get rough, bad things may happen. They make decisions that are not in your self-interest. So then he turns to this discussion of the citizen militia. And these are your own common people. Now, at this time, the nobles thought that the common people were incapable of any sort of military action. They did not arm them. They did not want to arm them. If they did have arms, they might actually turn against the nobles, who oftentimes preyed upon them. But they never thought they'd be able to win against other soldiers in battle, because they deemed them to lack intelligence and to lack courage. Really, they thought of their own class as being almost a different species than the common man. And so, most of them would have said, well, that's ridiculous. But remember that Machiavelli, when he worked for Florence, had actually been allowed to organize a small citizens' militia and try to experiment with it. He had to train them, he had to equip them, and so forth. And by the way, it didn't turn out well. Remember, the Spaniards came in and defeated them quite handily. But this did not ultimately change Machiavelli's perspective on the citizen militia. He didn't think it was a good enough experiment or enough of a test. Now, the strengths outweigh the weaknesses in his view of these people. This requires a very different way of thinking about them. He says that they will fight the most enthusiastically and actually be willing to risk their lives, unlike all three of the others, for the sake of the country, but only if they are provided with good reasons. And there are many people, many of the common people, way more than the elite few, the noble class. If you provide them with those good reasons, then Machiavelli says these people will be loyal to you, and the force of their numbers will be a great benefit to the prince. Now, what are those good reasons? Well, Machiavelli is going to argue in many different ways throughout much of this book that means providing the people with basic good government. That the problem is they are so disregarded that nobody seems to care about their basic safety, about their economic well-being. If a prince simply provided them with law and order and didn't overtax them, that would give them enough of a stake in his rule that they would be trusted with arms, and could actually fight enthusiastically. And Machiavelli glimpsed the insight that a force that is actually made up of men who are willing to risk their lives for the sake of their family's welfare is a very powerful and formidable force. Now, they do have weaknesses. They do require a lot more training. Machiavelli found out that it's very difficult to take someone who's never wielded any sort of weapon before out of the fields or out of the shop and turn them into a soldier. And of course, the government has to equip them with all the weapons that they have because they have nothing. And this is a great expense, especially a great initial expense. And of course, there's the weakness that if you do not provide them with good government, then they may use those very arms against you. So now you're limited. You're limited by who you gave the weapons to. Okay. However, Machiavelli seems to think that this is a good trade-off, that it's fairly easy for the prince to satisfy the people, so he's not terribly constrained. He's more constrained in real life by the nobles who are constantly going to make demands against him. Machiavelli advises that you cut the nobles down to size, take away some of their power, take away their land, take away their arms, and give them to the common people. So Machiavelli says on page 39, experience shows individual sovereigns and republics that arm the masses are capable of making vast conquests. And of course, he's talking about the citizen soldiers. He's talking about the Roman experience. This is why Machiavelli doesn't think that his experience with the Spaniards and that whole debacle, which led to the defeat of the Republic, he doesn't take that as the definitive sign that his way of doing things is wrong, because he has ancient history backing him up. If we look at the Romans, who used a huge army of citizen soldiers, and even took in soldiers from conquered territories and made them into Roman soldiers, it was the most formidable fighting force of the ancient world. So he thinks that is much more proof than the small failed experiment in his own time. And he does cite Cesare Borgia as proof. Remember, Cesare Borgia is his number one example of so many things, and so it's not surprising that he mentions him again in this context. He says on the bottom of page 43 of the Wooten edition, "A wise ruler, therefore, will always avoid using mercenary and auxiliary troops, and will rely on his own forces. He would rather lose with his own troops than win with someone else's. for he will not regard it a true victory if it is won with troops that do not belong to him. I never hesitate to cite Cesare Borgia as a model to be admired. This duke entered the Romagna with an auxiliary army, for his troops were all Frenchmen, and he used it to take Imola and Forlì. But since he did not feel such troops were reliable, he then switched over to mercenaries, believing that using them would involve fewer risks, and so he hired the Orsini and the Vitelli. But in practice he found them unreliable, treacherous, and dangerous, and so he got rid of them and formed his own army. And it is easy to see the differences among these three types of army, for you only have to consider how the Duke's reputation changed depending on whether he was relying on the French alone, on the Orsini and the Vitelli, or on his own troops and his own resources. With each change of policy it increased, but he was only taken seriously when everyone could see he was in complete command of his own forces. That's from chapter 13. So what is Machiavelli's ultimate political message here? Remember that at the beginning we talked about that passage that says that if you're going to have good laws, you have to have good arms. So Machiavelli is not going to talk much about laws. He's going to focus in on armies. Well, let's break this down a little bit. Yes, Machiavelli says that a ruler should concern himself mainly with armies, with defense and war. But then he argues, as we've seen in these chapters, that in order to be truly successful, the prince must use citizen armies, which is a brand new radical idea. And he says in order to get the loyalty of these citizens so that you can provide them with arms, you must also provide them with good laws. So I think when we look at it from this perspective, we can see that what he means is if you have the right type of army, which can win those battles for you, and keep you firmly in control of your power, not beholden to the elites, then you will have the citizens as the army, and you will have to give them good laws in order to maintain their loyalty. So good armies make good laws, okay? Which is different from saying that laws don't really need to be discussed, we don't really need to care about them because the only thing is armies, okay? He's saying that the common people can provide the prince with a much more effective form of protection, but only if he gives them good laws. Machiavelli says the best fortress for the prince is the support of the people. Far better than building walls is to have the people who can report upon any sort of spying that is going on, where countries send spies into your territory or investigate to see how vulnerable you are, because the people will report upon any such activity. If they hear about it, they will report upon people plotting against you, because they know that you are the source of all their benefits. Now, this is a way of viewing Machiavelli's prince that does support the interpretation of Machiavelli as a Republican author or as a patriot, a lover of the Italian people. And I'm sure you can see why. That through the back door, Machiavelli can be seen to have attempted to greatly benefit the common people, and he's elevated this idea, which we now call nationalism, patriotism, love of country, to a very high status, where really people in his time did not think in these terms, and certainly, as I've said, did not trust the common people to defend the